Hello everybody. So today we're going to talk about post-structuralism. I'm going to give you a little bit of a lead-in into postmodernism. And yeah, so that'll be our short lecture for the week. Okay, post-structuralism, I had you guys look at two people, Derrida and Foucault. I'm going to talk about them a bit more generally. It's kind of hard to get like a small snippet of somebody's work that actually like explains the whole idea behind it. So I gave you guys sort of small snippets, and I'm going to explain the overarching idea. So we can kind of view Derrida's leaping off point as Saussure, and Foucault's more as more thinking about sort of systems of symbols. So for Derrida, he's particularly interested in the part of Saussure that talks about difference. So if you think about, when we were talking about, streams versus rivers, right? They break up reality by creating categories. And so we mainly understand the world through separating things out, right? Derrida refers to this process as differentiation. So we're constantly differentiating ourselves from other things, right, or one object from another. But this process of differentiation isn't neutral. So in Saussure, it's sort of neutral. It doesn't really matter what category something is in, right? For Derrida, he wants to claim that our entire symbolic system, our language itself, implies hierarchy. So hierarchy is written into language, right? And it's largely written in language through this process of differentiation. So we can think about so part of this too is that this would mean, right? So like anytime we talk about something, there's latently implied its difference. What Derrida refers to as the trace of the other. The other being the other category from which we differentiated something. So a good example, Derrida is, really influential in something called post-colonialism. Post-colonialism is essentially the adaptation of post-structuralism to talk about colonialism. So in post-colonialism, generally it's going to be about how is it that sort of Western liberal democracies, right? European countries, North America. How is it that we understand ourselves in opposition to everyone else in the world? And here we see the kind of idea, right? So like the, us identifying ourselves as Western countries means that there's all this vaguely developed, right, other, non-Western. What is non-Western? Well, whatever we want to identify ourselves as, non-Western is automatically going to be the opposite of that. So if we want to identify ourselves as democratic, they become totalitarian. If we want to identify ourselves as, progressing through science, we identify them as, mirrored, bogged down in primitivism, as superstitious. So what we say about other people in the world or don't say about them has more to do with the identification of us as an object and us differentiating ourselves from other things. Within countries, we're always differentiating ourselves from populations like the poor, right? Men differentiate themselves from women, right? And women often being a negative category. So for Derrida, what he wants to claim is that within language, there's all these sort of negative categories, and there's all these positive categories. And so where Saussure really picks up on us creating difference, for Derrida, a lot of the differences that we experience are constructed, they're false. So where Saussure wants to bring out this creation of difference and arbitrariness of this creation of difference, what Derrida really wants us to see is the way this is more something that's weaponized than we ever recognize. And as such, forms of hierarchy and dominance are embedded inside of language itself. The act of sort of like taking something, statements, right? And this is the research that would go along with Derrida. You would do something called deconstruction. So if you guys ever heard the term deconstruction, that's Derridian. That's how you say that, right? It's something that grows out of Derrida. A deconstructionist essentially takes statements and then finds the sort of implicit forms of power in this. I'd acknowledge that my own work often is deconstructionist. So like, just to kind of give an example, like right now I'm writing about scientists who write about space. So what I'll do is I'll literally go through, these various texts, and I'll make all these notes in the back about moments where you can see sort of latent forms of power and dominance or hierarchy in the language that they use, right? So what I'm doing is I'm taking normal language, a specific set of discourse, right? As somebody now acknowledged that word discourse in their post on Foucault, right? Discourse is also a big thing within Derrida. So you take a specific piece of discourse and then you deconstruct it, right? And that's going to be true of both Derrida and Foucault. But with Derrida, it's particularly this idea of differentiation and otherness. The other is a common term within social science, within humanities. You see that all over the place. That comes from this language, right? This comes from post-structuralism. That the implied other of discourse. So it's that embedded form of difference making, that otherizing of people. Okay, so that's essentially the center of what Derrida is trying to capture. Foucault works a little bit different. So means they're very similar, right? And often people who are influenced by one will be influenced by the other. Post-structuralism in general is influenced by both, and they're probably the two biggest figures of post-structuralism. But the focus of Foucault is less on the language itself, and it's more on the ways in which the knowledge we construct and the power that dances behind it are never separate, right? Another way to put it for Foucault often, you'll hear people talk about power knowledge, as if it's one thing, right? That's a Foucauldian thing. That all forms of power construct knowledge to reinforce themselves. All forms of knowledge are latently reinforced by forms of power. So no knowledge is neutral. All knowledge is political. And this comes down to no matter what sort of discourse we're talking about, all of them lack neutrality. Now, for Foucault, power isn't pre-prescribed. Another way to put it, it's not what category you belong to. But instead, power is something that's enacted. It's something that's done, right? And it's largely done through, right, the construction of discourses. So Foucault's really interested in doing is sort of tracing out these long histories of different epistemologies, different ways of thinking about the world, and how they reflect different relationships of power. The order of things is a great example of that. So the order of things that I gave you in the section I gave you from the order of things is specifically about the construction of the human sciences. It's a construction, really Foucault wants to ask the question of when is it that man becomes an object of knowledge to himself? Man being the sort of general. When is it that human beings start constructing knowledge about human beings? And how does that change our relationship to one another? How does that change our relationship to power? So within Foucault, for long periods of time, people don't really talk or think about individuals, and as such, they don't recognize themselves as anything separate from a sort of collective. But we construct this object, this idea that individual is the human subject, and then that becomes itself a site, right? A site upon which, and this would be the language that Foucault would use, upon which power is written. Another way to think of it is who does the speaking and who does the looking within Foucault is really important. So any sort of act of observation is a form of power and also a form of knowledge. As I observe somebody, I construct knowledge about them, but that knowledge isn't neutral. It's used to, in one way or another, dominate over them. And we all kind of, in modern societies, once we become objects to ourselves, we all take turns being the looker. Okay, so examples of how this would work. One of Foucault's most famous books is a book on discipline called Discipline and Punishment. And Discipline and Punishment is about the construction of the penal system in policing. And so if you think about what police do, right? Police go around and they essentially make observations, right? They make observations and they create catalogs of those observations. If you've ever seen a police officer in their squad car, they have this laptop and they can pull up anybody's name, right? And find out everything that they've ever done. Essentially, that's because police are watchers. They're constructing a knowledge. That construction of knowledge is intertwined with the form of power that exists within our society. We exist in a society where a catalog is kept on us. In terms of schools, right? Like you guys have work that you do. It's my job, right, to keep a catalog. I watch you. I make observations about your work, and I use those observations to generate numeric representations of your performance that then are stored away, right? After you leave here, every job you interview for, you will record back the result of the observations of your professors, your GPA. Right? This is a form of power, right? It's a form of guaranteeing your behavior, getting you to do things that you wouldn't do otherwise. In turn, right, you observe me and you fill out student evaluations, and student evaluations become a record, right? And when I apply for tenure, etc., like, they will look at those things. So I watch you, you watch me, and we all keep a catalog. But basically what his point is that all this sort of catalog keeping, all this sort of observation that's born out of the invention of the idea of the human individual, all of this makes power more and more intrusive. So before we have power as sort of unintrusive, it's big, it's dramatic, it's violent, right? You can think about things like, you know, Discipline and Punishment starts with these sort of descriptions of these really like violent executions done by, you know, basically by kings, right? In the era before modernity. And how different the form of power we enact now is. But it's more intrusive, it pays more attention. And as such, like, I internalize it more. I am more aware of myself, right, and my actions and the things that I do, and I become hyper aware and controlling of myself, so that I live in this constant state of observation. So that's kind of how Foucault works, right? In Foucault, like, you have this discourse, right, the discourse of the individual, right, that creates a specific epistemology, but along with that is a certain form of dominance. We wouldn't have created the discourse if there wasn't something that's being used from it. So, like, in essence, what Foucauldians will do mostly is they'll go out and they'll look at specific forms of knowledge, right? A specific science, a specific way of talking about people in a specific place, and they'll try to sort of pull out, right, that understanding. This is they'll try to figure out what is the origins, right, of this discourse, and how do we see power interacting with it. So those are sort of our two examples of post-structuralism. The general takeaway: what is post-structuralism about? Post-structuralism is about knowledge and language and how it interacts with power and dominance. So it's basically taking that form of French structuralism and then morphing it into, right, this language about power and dominance, seeing that within it. And so we deconstruct, right? We deconstruct that power. We figure it out, which isn't meant to be a permanent analysis. It's going to change, right? And any form of knowledge we construct is also involved in forms of power. So no matter what, deconstruction is this sort of constant process. Okay. So that's the first of what we could also call, and now I'm going to segue into talking about postmodernism, the first of what we could call our post-perspectives. There are three general post-perspectives. We look at two of them. Often people will refer to all of these as postmodernism. That gets a little muddled because they're not actually the same philosophies. They're not actually the same theories. So post-structuralism, if you remember, post-structuralism is always about power and language. There's also something called post-positivism. Post-positivism is an attempt to reconfigure how we talk about science, in particular interested in ways in which science are a social phenomenon. We don't look at that specifically in here, but that's also dances behind how people will often talk about postmodernism, where you hear people talking about, well, it's nothing but but relativism. I think a lot of what dances behind people's minds is actually post-positivism, not post-structuralism or postmodernism. And I think you can see that, like, especially like the idea that like postmodernism really cares about subjectivity, right? And then people are often talking about Foucault. Well, for Foucault, there is no such thing as a human subject, ergo, no such thing as subjectivity. Everything is a part of this sort of like removed discourse from us, right? So like there is no place for subjectivity in that, and ergo, there is no place for relativism. Okay, the last one, the one that we're going to look at next week is postmodernism. Now, postmodernism just means that what we're in is no longer modernity. Simply any perspective that claims that we can no longer use 18th century paradigms to understand the world around us is a form of postmodernism. A lot of these are rejections of Marxism in particular, and both of the ones that you're looking at could be seen as a rejection of Marxism. But the rejection of the idea that we exist in a modern state at all anymore, that we exist in a modern society, and instead we have to create a new theoretical language for our society. We have to create an understanding of the postmodern. You see things like discussions of globalization and late modern capitalism, like those are also forms of postmodernism. People who talk about us living in a post-industrial society, those are forms of postmodernism. We're going to look particularly at Lyotard and Baudrillard. These are two of the more extreme forms of postmodernism. And so when you read through this, keep that in mind. Think about what is it that they're saying about how society changes. How is what we exist different from modernity, right? That's really going to get into the key of what their theories are. So that's your homework for the week. And I'll have one, I believe it's just one more video. Oh no, we got 2 more videos happening. So so we have 2 more videos. I'll have one where I explain, like I did today, in more depth postmodernism, and then we'll have one discussing feminism. So have a great week. Stay safe. Communicate with me if you need anything, or if you just want to communicate. So have a great day. Talk to you soon.